Hill, and I'm the Managing Director for Academic Publishing here at Cambridge. And I've got two responsibilities this morning. The most important, of course, is to welcome and introduce Sir John Houghton, one of the most distinguished climate scientists of his generation, and a tenacious campaigner for the recognition of the issue of human-induced climate change. And I'm going to give a broader introduction to Sir John in just a moment. But my second duty is to inform you that there are no fire alarm tests planned this morning. We always have to do these things, don't we? So if you do hear a continuous alarm, please treat it as real, and all visitors follow staff members. Obviously, you're going to recognise the staff member because they'll be the ones leaving very quickly and looking like they know where they're going. And the assembly points are on the playing field. That's admin, out of the way. So let me return to the important task of a proper introduction to our distinguished speaker. So John has been a strong advocate for global research into climate change and has played a key role in the development of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and where he led or co-led the science working group of the IPCC from 1988 to 2002. As lead editor of the first three IPCC reports, he brought the first of those reports to the press here in Cambridge in 1990. And we've now distributed over 160,000 copies of the IPCC reports over the past 25 years, with the latest being published just a few months ago. He's one of those rare academics that publishers dream of. He's a fine and influential researcher who has been able to synthesise science into elegant prose, and this, of course, has been really necessary when it comes to the often contentious issue of human-induced climate change. And he manages to combine these talents with being a true gentleman and a pleasure for everyone to work with. He's also brought his lucid writing to two important textbooks that have been cornerstones to our early Earth science publishing. The first of those was the Physics of Atmospheres, first published in 1977, which has sold over 15,000 copies over 3 editions. But also he's the author of our best-selling textbook, Global Warming, The Complete Briefing. I'd like to read a couple of comments from reviews of this title. The first is the definitive scientific book on global warming by one of the few authors who is actually in a position to give a complete briefing. And the second review comment is it's difficult to imagine how Houghton's exposition of this complex body of information might be substantially improved upon. Very impressive comments, I'm sure you will agree. And the first 4 editions of Global Warming have sold over 40,000 copies since 1997, and the 5th edition has just been published, and we're delighted to see that. So John went to Oxford to study physics at the age of just 16, and I've just discovered he had a scholarship to go to Oxford. He became the Professor of Atmospheric Physics at Oxford and the Chief Executive at the Met Office, where he founded its Hadley Centre for Climate Prediction and Research, and was at the helm at the time of the Great Storm of 1987, and I'm sure had nothing to do with Michael Fisher's predictions at the time. He was advisor to Margaret Thatcher and received a knighthood in 1991. As a past chair of the science working group of the IPCC, he was in the delegation that went to Oslo when the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007. He has described global warming as a weapon of mass destruction and has done much to ensure that climate skeptics have not had a free run, including having to defend himself against misquotations. Sir John has remained a strong Christian throughout his life and believes in the connection between Christianity and environmentalism. We're delighted today that Sir John has been able to join us for the opening of the 25 years of the IPCC Reports exhibit here in the Press Museum, and to celebrate a long and fruitful relationship between Sir John and Cambridge University Press. John is going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes about global warming and the IPCC, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So I'd like to now hand over to Sir John. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for those kind words. Very nice to be here in Cambridge. I haven't been to Cambridge for a long time, actually. In fact, my Cambridge visits have been rather rare over the years. It's hard to get from Oxford to Cambridge after all. And Cambridge has no mountains, and I love mountains, so I don't come here automatically. But anyway, it's very good to be here this morning with you, and I've just put some slides together about global warming, and I'll go through these slides, and then you can ask me questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Although as advanced age comes on, not quite as good at answering questions as I used to be. Okay, so let's begin with these slides. The challenge of global warming. The underlying, I'm probably telling you things you know already, I'm sure. The underlying science of global warming is not difficult. It's been known for 200 years. The greenhouse effect occurs. If we can have the next slide, please. The sun shines radiation, which hits the Earth's surface in the absence of any absorption by the atmosphere. And that has to be balanced, of course, by radiation going out from the Earth's surface. That radiation going out, some of it is absorbed by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They're called greenhouse gases because this is the way greenhouses work, because it's the roof of a greenhouse that blocks the radiation going out and enables it to be warm inside. Hence the name, the greenhouse effect. And the next slide, please, thank you. And carbon dioxide is the most important of the gases we're talking about. It's been in the atmosphere for a long time. In fact, it had about 270 parts per million for millions of years, actually, before the present. But then, 100 or 200 years ago, it began to rise because of these greenhouse gases, and it's carried on rising, and it's now, it isn't destroyed in the atmosphere at all rapidly, so it just accumulates there, and the amount of it goes up. It's now about 400 parts per million, which is a lot bigger than 270 parts per million. It's one of the main greenhouse gases. And that's the problem we face. It's acting as a blanket over the Earth's surface, keeping it warmer than it would otherwise be. That's the effluent from power stations, gases from power stations going into the atmosphere, and there are lots of them around, and you're very familiar with them. It's not unknown to anybody, and it's a very, very simple idea, in fact, a very simple bit of physics, which is there at the basis of the whole business of greenhouse warming. Now, over 10,000 years, carbon dioxide has gone up, as I've just explained, and you can see it was very steady until about 100 years ago, and now it's going up really rather fast, and it's heading for this 400 parts per million, or over 400 parts per million, or thereabouts. So what's the effect that had on the Earth's temperature, average temperature? Next one. There's a map of the Earth, with mean temperature change from the 1950s to the year 2000 or so. You can see that the oceans still remain fairly cool, of course, because there's a lot of water there, and you don't warm the oceans very fast. In fact, the oceans about half a degree on average are warmed over this period. The land, half a degree to 2 degrees in warming over this period. The Arctic, for reason, has been connected, of course, with the ice and all that sort of thing, has gone up quite a lot more, and the land areas have gone up between half and 2 degrees, of course, the 2 degrees there in the northern regions. And that's quite a striking diagram, and it's and quite a good diagram, and it's accurate information. So there's the Arctic part. That's showing the minimum ice that has ever been in the Arctic in the year 2012. The pink line is what it was about about the year between 1990 to 2000 or so, and you can see the reduction in the amount. This is the minimum ice, of course, occurring in the month of September. Minimum ice each year. That's what it was in the year 2012, and it's a lot less. It's only about half the size that it was in the year about 2000. So it's a big change. And things of that kind occurring in the Arctic. Now, the climate system is pretty complicated. That just shows you some of the things that occur within what we call the climate system, which is the Earth, of course, and the sea, the oceans, the atmosphere, the gases, the aerosols, the human influences, because we've put things into the atmosphere too, as I was just explaining, and volcanoes and interactions with the biosphere, interactions between different parts of the ocean, and it's a complicated business. And how can we conceivably put this or work out what's the effect of increased greenhouse gases or increased carbon dioxide on that system? Big challenge. Now, fortunately, since the 1980s, there's been an enormous revolution in our ability to understand this detail. And where has that come from? It's come from global data from satellites and climate modelling from the increasingly powerful computers. Lots of you know about computers, and you know how fast computers have been getting improved information because of their fast rising in the whole business. Next slide. Well, there's that just shows you, of course, a typical picture with enormous detail, far more than you can see on that diagram, which comes from the Earth from space. We can see it the whole time. Before the satellite era, of course, we couldn't see it. I began my research by flying up in aeroplanes, looking at the stratosphere, and I could get measurements from the Earth's surface, but just over this part of the world, the part of the world which I was flying in. The rest of the atmosphere, of course, was interacting with my bit, but I had no knowledge of that interaction because there was no way I could learn about it. That was around 1960 or so, in that sort of period. And so the growth in our information that has come from satellite information, getting information from all right the way of the atmosphere, has been enormous. And that's enabled us to do the sort of things we're doing today. Next slide. Now that illustrates what's happened with some calculations, some models. We're going from the year 1900 to the year about 2010. These are observations of the global mean temperature as averaged over the globe and as measured, of course, in space, and as modelled by computers, putting in all the things that change the Earth's, the atmosphere in terms of its temperature. And that's quite a very big thing to do, of course, but we've managed to do it. And you can see on the left-hand diagram there, this shows you the black line. This is the observed changes in the Earth's temperature, or atmosphere's temperature rather. And the red line is that as simulated by a model, putting in all the forcings we know about, putting in all the things that determine it. And you can see the agreement is surprisingly good, considering that there's a lot of the variability, the movements of ups and downs on the black line, of course, for all sorts of reasons. If you look below that diagram, you will see the various volcanoes mentioned, and they have that cool the Earth, and you will see that cooling occurring each time around. There are lots of things that are occurring there, which we can take account of. It's quite remarkable you can get a diagram which agrees so well. But now if you leave out from that the forcing due to increased carbon dioxide, look on the other side of the diagram, you will see the blue line, and you see it was agreeing quite well up to the year 1960 or so, but then the increase of greenhouse gases, and this is all coming from fossil fuel burning, coal and oil and gas, that has cooled the Earth very substantially by a big, this is cooling of the whole Earth, whole atmosphere, you see. That's a big change in the temperature of the whole atmosphere. And that's a diagram which really shows you that something is happening and why it's happening. We know it's happening and we know why it's happening. And that's the global warming. Next slide, please. Here we have the annual temperatures predicted now by the models for 2050. The oceans are still keeping quite cool, of course, because there's an awful lot of ocean to warm up, and I'll say a bit more about that in a bit. And the oceans are warming perhaps 1 to 2 degrees. That's all. Much of it is less than 1 degree, not even less than 1 degree, some of it still. But then if you look at the land is going up sometimes like 2 to 4 degrees. That's a big number in terms of average global average temperature of the temperature of a given place. Average of the Earth at any part of the Earth. That's a big change, and that's a 2050 sort of number. I'll say a bit more about possibilities later on of what the change might be. So what are the main impacts of the climate change? That changes in temperature. What impact will that have on the Earth's surface and on our lives? Well, the first impact is an obvious one, is that because the oceans are warming, the rise of sea level. The ocean water, particularly near the surface, is expanding and raising the sea level. And then more intense heat waves, and we've been seeing those around the world over the last few years, and some desperately intense heat waves in various parts of the world. We haven't had many in the UK, but they've even had them in Russia, and places like Australia have had very intense ones, and all around the world, and some of these have been very damaging, and in some of them lots of people have died prematurely because of the heat wave. There was one in New York in 2003, and it's estimated just from the deaths recorded that something like 20,000. Is that 20,000? Is that the right number? So I mustn't overquote. A lot of people died as a result of that. And then we have the more intense hydrological cycle, with a greater frequency and intensity of droughts and floods, and I'll say a bit more about that later on too. Going now to the sea level rise again. There's a diagram of sea level rise. Estimate, as observed to the present, and of course the sea level is only rising slowly because it takes a long time to warm the oceans. Estimated rise by the end of this century, depending on just how much in the way of greenhouse gases we emit, will depend on that and on other things too. And the range you can see on the right-hand side of that diagram, and it falls between 0.5 metre and 1 metre. And the sea level also rising, of course, because of the melting of the ice caps. Glaciers are melting around the world, and the ice caps are melting. I showed you a slide of just how little ice there is now in the northern hemisphere compared with what there was. And that's just melting of the ice caps, and that's adding to this process of the sea level rise. So we're going to get something of the order of being very conservative, 0.5 metre, and probably around 1 metre by the end of this century. Now, Cambridge isn't that far from the sea. In this part of the United Kingdom, if you go to the east, you'll find the sea appearing rather earlier than you'd expect by the time this century is over. And it have a big impact on this part of the UK. For instance, I live in West Wales and we have mountains which will keep it away, but the damage there could be, we've already seen sea level rise in parts of Wales. But then, next slide please, go to Bangladesh. There's a map of Bangladesh with the 1, 2, 3 and 5 metre contours of sea level. There are 10 million people living below the 1 metre contour. And where are those people going to go? I was talking to a Bangladeshi person quite recently, and he said, "Oh, it's much more than 10 million that are going to be affected. It's more like 40 million if we get 1 metre of sea level rise." Well, we know all about refugees in the world at the moment, trying to move and can't move. The Indians are building a fence all the way around Bangladesh, around the barrier, around the frontier, to keep the Bangladeshis out. Because they have a lot of problems at the moment, but they don't want a lot of refugees coming in either, because they're a very crowded country. Now, there are lots of places in the world which will have the same problem. Some even having a bigger problem than Bangladesh. So the problems of movements of people that can't live where they are will be enormous by the end of this century. And somehow people don't realise this. But why they don't realise it, I don't really know, because some of us have been talking about it for some time. And that's in Bangladesh, the top one is some refugees that are trying to find their way somewhere else at the moment. But having said that, I'll come back to some of the science, but let me now talk a bit about the IPCC. Formed in 1988 by 2 United Nations bodies, the World Meteorological Organization, which is based in Geneva, and I had quite a lot to do with it then because I was head of the British Met Office, and the United Nations Environment Programme based in Nairobi. Those bodies joined together to form the IPCC. So 1988 was an interesting year, actually. It was the year that Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister, she gave the annual lecture at the dinner of the Royal Society. She was a scientist, and she was very keen on being seen as a scientist. And she gave this lecture, and quite a significant part of the lecture was concerned with global warming. Many people thought I had a lot to do with that. I had nothing to do with it, actually, because there are other people who've been advising her about that talk. And it was on the front page of the Times as one main headline in the Times the following morning about global warming. So she began to get very interested in it. And in the end of 1988, the IPCC set up, had its first meeting. We had 3 working groups, to assess the science, assess the impacts, and formulate the response. And that we got together at the end of 1988. And in fact, I had some part in that because I was asked to take on the science working group. And the Prime Minister, dear Margaret Thatcher, helped me a great deal, actually. She provided all the money, a few million, for better computers at the Met Office to work on it. And she was very interested in trying to make sure that I had the resources, because the Met Office didn't have any real, it was a bit outside what we were supposed to do, you see. So she provided all sorts of money for us. And she was an enormous support of those years, and I could say more about her, but I'll leave it at that. And then, since 1988, the IPCC working group. We got going with working group 1, and as you know, of course, from this meeting and the public things around it, you will know that the CUP has published these 5 working group 1 reports. I hadn't realised till today what numbers you've got rid of. Yeah. Very big numbers by any publishing standards, and it's the first was in 1990, of course, and the 5th has just come out at the end of 2013, 1,500 A4 pages. Not an easy thing to lift, never mind read, but it contains an enormous amount of information. Let's go back to the IPCC reports for a minute. The summaries of the reports were agreed at intergovernmental meetings, and these were typically lasting 3 days. You'd have representatives from 100 plus governments, simultaneous translation into 6 languages. And we had to go through these summaries of our reports, sentence by sentence, with a number of people in the body. We were entirely a scientific body, so people couldn't have any other argument for changing something. It had to be a scientific argument. There were strictly scientific, not political meetings, but there were people there who were political representatives from bodies concerned with oil coming out of the ground and so on. They were very, very concerned to try to get rid of the sort of thing we were trying to do. So they were very tough meetings indeed. But we did get through. We got through these reports, and I won't tell you more about them now. If any of you want to know more, I have an autobiography. There's quite a bit about it in it, called "In the Eye of the Storm." And I really felt in the eye of the storm as I was doing this chairing in this body. So we moved. I have diagrams of the reports on the.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, there it is. That's on the bottom. That's right. And so we have these documents which were thrown out by CUP, and we're enormously grateful that CUP published the first one of these so fast. And because that was actually very important in the political scene at that time when the first report was published. And I'd say strong attempts by some people, some countries, to weaken the reports all the way through. Thank you. Next one. Well, then, 1992 was the Earth Summit in Rio. 25,000 delegates to that summit meeting. 172 countries and over 100 heads of state attended. It was by far the biggest international conference of that kind under the UN, which had ever been taken to that day, and I still think it's probably one of the biggest ever anyway. The object was to do with a variety of things, but because of what the IPCC had done, and because of the report had been published very fast by CUP in order to get into the preparation for that event, they were able to set up the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which was a very important body, and it still is existing, of course, and the report of that, from that conference, from that summit, was ratified by all participants, including the US Senate, within 1 week. And that was, in today's terms, that was incredible that happened. But you see, the people who were opposing it hadn't really got going because they didn't realise what it was all about. It was too early for them to be active. It was after that that bodies like ExxonMobil and other oil companies and other companies concerned with fossil fuel energy, and people in the Middle Eastern countries concerned about getting oil out of the ground, all that, got together in big ways, spent millions of their pounds or their currencies in trying to weaken the whole process and destroy what we were doing and get politicians on their side. It became a big political battle. And within the United States, of course, they were extremely successful. The United States still does not, many of the people in the Senate do not believe it's happening. And many of the people living in the United States, because of the publicity over these years, and it's a long time ago now, do not believe it's happening. Because they think these scientists are all having, their science is just invented by them, or they're making it appear far worse than it really is, in order to get publicity for the science. That's the message many people in the United States still have. So it's a big problem, and remains so. Let me just go back to the rest of the science, if I may, to turn global warming. I told you about the rise in sea level. I told you about the heat waves. The next thing is the other big problem is that as water vapor increases in the atmosphere, because the evaporation of the Earth's surface from the sea is larger, that water vapor gets larger, and as that water vapor condenses into clouds, the latent heat is released. That latent heat is therefore larger, and the factor is quite large, and so we're getting more energy put into the atmosphere circulation as a result of that. And that latent heat release, as water vapor turns into clouds, is the biggest single source of energy for the atmosphere circulation. So you have a more energetic hydrological cycle. The atmosphere is more energetic in all the things it does, and that tends to bring more floods and more droughts. And that's just simple science, simple physics. Though the whole processes, of course, are quite complex, what's driving them is known now quite well. So the result of this is that we are getting more droughts. There's drought in Africa, and we could show you lots of pictures of that kind. Next one, thank you. And then rainfall is changing as a result of this change in circulation. Many of the areas, this is the estimated rainfall change by the 2090s. That's minus 20 or more % decrease in places like the Mediterranean, places like southern part of America, or near the tropics, and also South Africa and Australia and so on. And then the rainfall will be increasing at high latitudes in both hemispheres, particularly in the northern hemisphere, and there'll be big changes in rainfall. Now, those are very big changes in average rainfall. So, and the water distribution and all the rest of it will be very much affected by that too. So if we now summarise the sort of thing I've said about the changes, and just run down that list very fast, the Greenland ice cap is beginning, of course, to melt down. It won't, whether it really will melt down will depend on just how big the change is. If the change is big, it will start to melt down continuously now for a long time. It will take a long time for that to happen, but it will give us 7 meters of sea level rise when it's all melted, for instance. And the same similar things in the southern hemisphere. So we're going to get, the poor nations will be the worst affected. many millions of refugees, and then something that doesn't worry us as people, but it worries people who are concerned about the species of animals and plants and all the rest of it over the Earth's surface. We will lose millions of species because species will have the wrong weather. The climate will be wrong for them, and they will disappear. And that's not often publicised very much, but that's going to happen at some level, and that's really not a good thing. That our generation should have been the one that's lost millions of species. It's really a pretty nasty thing for us to have to face for our generation. And then the next one. Now, looking ahead towards 2050, what have we got to do in order to try and do something about it? There's been agreed that we should have a 2-degree target of maximum temperature rise averaged over the Earth. That means the temperature of the ocean, of course, won't rise by that much, but the land will be rising a bit more, but the average will be 2 degrees for maximum temperature rise. How can we manage to reach that? Well, here is the emissions of carbon dioxide on the left-hand side. You will see that we're talking about, it's been rising ever since 1990. It's now about 50% more than it was in 1990, and then it's still going up. And if we do nothing about it, we will have the red line. What we have to do is to cut the rate of that emission, and it's beginning to change a little bit now. Very small amount. But we've got to go down the green line to about 50% less than it was in 1990 by 2050. And in the developed world, we have to cut down much more, actually, because the developing world want to use it. But we must let them have some share in it, because they haven't had their share yet. So that's the aim for 2050. And there will be a meeting, as you probably all know, in Paris in December of this year, which will be looking at this, and we'll be trying to come up with a method of reaching the 2-degree target, which has been generally agreed by the UN bodies around the world, the United Nations meetings and so on. We've all agreed we should be going no more than 2 degrees. It's a bit high, really, but if we can reach 2 degrees maximum, that would be very good. And it's been very, very hard to reach. But in order to reach it, every country has to really take it very seriously. Now, so what have we got to do in order to cut it? We have to bring on renewable energies very fast. We have to bring on solar energy. We have to turn biomass and waste into energy. That's beginning to happen. And the world can get 10% of its energy from biomass and waste quite easily. Then we have to bring on electric cars, which is the next picture. Thank you. Do any of you have an electric car? Nobody at all. I have an electric car. They're expensive. It's stupidly expensive. They shouldn't be so expensive, anything like it. But the car I have will go, my wife's, it's my wife's actually, not mine, but it goes up, it manages 60 or 70 miles on one charge, goes quite a long way. The cost of the electricity is 2p a mile. That's all it costs to run. It's quiet, it's charged like an ordinary car, and it's not producing, well, except of course some of the electricity as it goes into it may produce a bit of coal, oil, gas, and white coal, oil, and gas from power stations, but it's beginning to, it's not producing any pollution, of course, of other kinds. So the world should take on electric cars in a big way. And we managed to get ours at half price because we went to a garage who had a few of them to sell, weren't selling them. so we got one which had only done 300 miles and was only a year old for half of its price, which is really not good, I think. But, so you can try it out somewhere if you want to do that. And then the UK has a lot of tidal energy we could harness. I live in Wales, and some of us have been working very hard at trying to persuade the powers that be in Welsh Assembly and so on that we should be building barrages or we should be building turbines, underwater turbines like you see there, to get tidal energy. We could build lagoons and so on along the north coast of Wales. We could build a barrage in the Severn. We could get the whole of Wales's electricity without any difficulty from tidal energy and without any nasty problems associated with it, because it's hard to see these things and it wouldn't be dangerous or anything like that. And a lot more could be done around England too. We get a lot of it from that sort of thing. So we should be trying to do those sorts of things in our country. And then there's wind energy, of course, which we're beginning to go in for a big way, and that's a bit uncertain, of course, because you never know quite when the wind's going to blow. But that's a good way to be doing it. The price is coming down. That's another way of doing it without any. And there are lots more things that are going on in that area. And now just a few things to finish with. Climate change is a moral imperative. We've grown our wealth in the rich world through cheap coal and oil and gas. Didn't realise the damage we caused, especially to poor countries. And we need to reduce the damage and assist poor countries to develop sustainably. We should get on with it. Haven't we first to tackle the next one? Haven't we first to tackle world poverty, then climate change? No, because if we tackle climate change, unless we tackle climate change now, the plight of the world's poorest will be enormously worse. Then can the world afford the necessary energy revolution? The International Energy Agency. How many of you know about the International Energy Agency? It's a big body in Paris. It's run by the world's governments. It's to do with advising them about energy. It's not a green body at all. It's a body of expert engineers and people of that kind. And in 2006, the G8 meeting in Edinburgh of the G8 nations asked the IEA to tell them how the emissions of greenhouse gases could be reduced in order to meet the demand of this 2 degrees. And they started to work at that, and they've written a volume a year of the IEA. They've told the world that they know how it can be done. They show all the detail, the financial detail, the economics of it, and the technology of it, and all those things, and how it can be done. And they've produced a new volume every year to try to explain it better, one way or another. You find very few people have seen these volumes, which is an awful shame. I don't know why they haven't been more published. And so the IEA is saying absolutely yes, we can afford the necessary revolution because the savings on fuel we will make by 2050 will be greater than the cost of the change, even if you allow for big discounts that economists like to put in on those sorts of transactions. And there'll be other important benefits too, right? Can we wait and see? No, we can't wait and see, because if CO2 emissions stop tomorrow, climate change would increase over 100 years. It wouldn't stop. We can't stop it. Even if we turned off all these greenhouse gas emissions, because of the time taken to warm the oceans won't be in equilibrium. So the energy is 90% of the excess energy goes into the oceans, warming the oceans, and they'll take 100 years plus to warm. And so they'll carry on warming. So if we carry on now without taking any notice of this, it'll be worse than it is at the moment. that the increase will carry on and we can't turn it back. So we can't wait and see. It's absolutely not true. And then, so this aim of a 2-degree target of a pre-industrial, I've already mentioned that. And this critical meeting in Paris has to agree action, and countries really have to take action in a big way in order to make that happen. And then the final slide pretty well is the message from Ban Ki-moon in the end of 2014 about the IPCC synthesis report that was then published, of course, by CUP. And he was commenting on it at the meeting when that day came out, saying this report gives a major push for success at Paris next year. Without a global agreement, we will not mobilise actions to the extent necessary or to get the world on a 2-degree pathway. Science has spoken. There is no ambiguity in their message. Leaders must act. Time is not on our side. The final slide is just to give you a nice picture of the Earth as seen from the Moon. Caring for the Earth. It looks, we thought, I used to think nothing humans could do could really damage the whole of the Earth. But now I know that's not true. Caring for the Earth, it's a scientific challenge, it's a moral challenge, and it's a spiritual challenge. Thank you very much.
Should we save a bit of energy and turn the air conditioner off because it's cold? Would that be, could we just, I don't know if it's still cold.
Save some energy.
Save some energy. So huge thanks to Sir John for his travelled all the way from the west coast of Wales to give us a really illuminating talk, because I think a lot of us here absorb some of the information we've heard today from the press, from the internet, but to hear it from first-hand, as we've done today, from one of the great climate scientists of our time, it's been a real honour and a pleasure, so thank you. Thank you. So I've worked with John on 3 editions of Global Warming, and I think one of the things that I've always found a great pleasure to work with is your optimism, really quite inspiring. And I think that's really given you a huge, it's not blind optimism, considered optimism, when you're dealing with all those myriad of politicians and the energy lobbies and the like. And I think trying to be useful in negotiations when you're trying to get people who are poles apart. So I feel as though I've learned a lot from you personally, just seeing how you've worked. And I think from that, it was the IPCC reports and getting those so that they could publish in time for the big meetings. There's been pressure on us at times, and it's been huge pressure for you guys pulling those together. But I think we should all be proud of the fact that we managed that over many years. So I guess we're going to ask some questions now, and I want to open it to you. But I kind of wanted to pose the first one, which is really, moving into the first summit that we all were publishing towards was the Rio summit, and now we're heading into Paris. So I just wanted to ask about your levels of optimism. Going to that first meeting, going now where with the science's conclusions are stronger than ever. How are you feeling about the state of things as we head towards that Paris summit?
Well, I'm an optimist, actually. I believe it will happen. I believe we will make some progress. Whether we'll actually make the progress we want to make, but depends on all sorts of people, of course. Depends on a really big push, on a big wave, because there are so many who don't want to know. And the reason they don't want to know is not because they haven't learnt about it, not because, well, they haven't learnt about it, actually. They don't want to know. They just don't want to know. And it makes me very sad, really, because why should people act in a way that's very irresponsible when they face something which is a big world issue, and the scientists of the world are all uniformly, except for about 1% or 2% at the very most, who would follow with the IPCC reports. Why don't people really take them seriously? And we live in a funny world of the way in which information goes around and the way the press works on information, which is sometimes good, sometimes very good, sometimes extremely good, and sometimes absolutely appalling. And the public at large, of course, don't know the science at all well, so they listen to various messages. They don't know which message to take on board. And And there are still far too many people who are saying, oh yes, it's happening, we know it's happening, but it won't matter. Now that's almost saying worse than saying it's not happening, because you say it doesn't matter, and because they haven't done their homework. So encourage all your friends and everybody to do their homework, so that they really know what's going to happen. Otherwise our children and our grandchildren are going to suffer enormously. Not to mention all those poor creatures in the world that won't be living anymore.
Pretty sombre words. I'd like to take some questions now from the audience. Anybody want to start off? Kevin.
I've read that one of the biggest contributions an individual can make is through vegetarianism or support for various forms of organic farming, given the hugely wasteful nature of the food production chain currently in terms of energy efficiency. Yeah. I wondered if you had any comments on that.
Well, I'm not an expert on food, and I'm not an expert on what you eat, but I do know, of course, that producing lots of beef, cattle, is an expensive way of doing it. And from the point of view of emissions of gases, because they need all this, what happens is that as you produce that beef, it does send more greenhouse gases out into the atmosphere, and is not, from the point of view of global warming, it's not a good idea. And also, I also know that it's not good for our own health, because you're allowed a certain amount of beef if you want to be healthy. If you want to be very healthy, you just do not eat the sort of beef that's spreading around the world. And of course, the Chinese are now getting rich and beginning to eat lots of beef and things like that. And it's not any good for the world. And we should be nor for our diets and nor for people's health. So there are lots of things we can do which will not only help our health, but will help the whole global warming business. And we should be looking as a world at the sort of things we are producing in the food business. And the whole of agriculture, there's a big movement now, in fact, amongst agricultural scientists and people working on it, to see how they're beginning to realise that you can emit extra CO2 from agriculture, or you can absorb it by other sources of other agricultural means, and which happens on any given occasion is still not well known. It still needs working out in a big way. So there's a lot of work to be done in the agricultural area to try to help the atmosphere remove some of its carbon dioxide and put it into the ground. So there's a great deal to be done in the agricultural area, which should be a big priority.
That actually, in some ways. On the radio this morning, there was an interview with an eminent scientist whose name escapes me. My problem along with his, I think. He was a very important man. But he was talking about...
Stevens.
Pardon?
Lord Stevens, if you were listening to the Today programme.
It was, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. He was talking about climate change and, in no uncertain terms, about the climate change deniers and everything. And he was also talking about the problem of soil depletion.
Yes.
And I wondered to what extent the two are linked. I don't know whether they might be linked a bit. I suppose partly because as the agricultural land is flooded, and we're all pushed onto land that's not so good for agriculture, there's that aspect of the soil not being good enough. But other aspects are possibly the soil erosion with more rainfall and what have you, or is it an entirely separate thing to do with the chemical depletion of the soil?
Yes. Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. What the way you do your farming determines how much carbon dioxide goes in or out to the land, and the land can form quite a lot of wood, as it often does. And when you can imagine the world with the rainfall changes that I showed you on that slide, we're going to have some very dry areas, the soil is going to suffer in various places, and big changes are going to occur. And some of those will be removing CO2 from the atmosphere, but some of them will be pushing a lot more into it. And we've got to really do our homework on how we do our agriculture, not as we do it now, but how we do it when the rainfall will be changed. And I don't think there's a lot going on about that in the whole of the agricultural science area. But some is certainly going on. But it's a big area, because there are big changes to be worked out, and if we do it right, it will help to drag CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is what we desperately need to do.
Okay, thank you. Christian, over there.
Does it worry you, Sir John, that there's a significant number of politicians who believe that changing public behaviour is too difficult, and they'd rather opt for the idea of geoengineering our way out of the current crisis? I know the Royal Society's already looked at a number of rather extreme ways of changing our atmosphere. So how do you think this might impact on the talks in Paris?
Well, geoengineering, you see, it's attractive in a way to some people because it's exciting. What could we do, you see, by playing in the atmosphere alone? Things I can do myself in the atmosphere, which would help to drag CO2 out of the atmosphere, or else introduce other material into the atmosphere, which will reflect sunlight and get rid of some of it, etc., etc. Now, the big problem with geoengineering is that we don't know enough to know what any given thing that we do will make, what difference it will make. But we do know that it will make different differences around the globe. Some places will be worse off for other reasons, because you happen to have put in some dust in a given place which didn't have dust before. So there will be people really complaining about that like anything. And other places might be improved by it because they're getting, helping to reduce the carbon dioxide content of the whole Earth. And we do not, and we'll never be able to make those calculations properly in order to make sure that we are doing something which is good and not bad. It's not so common now, but there used to be a lot of people who were making rain. You know, people who were trying to make rain by doing various things of different kinds. By seeding clouds. And there was a man, I could tell you a story about a man in America who was seeding clouds and making rain. He was making money because if he made so much rain, they'd pay him for it, you see. And it was rain above or below the average. If it was above the average, then they'd pay him a lot of money. And he got a tremendous amount of money one year because it happened to be a particularly wet year in that part of the country. But then he got into difficulties because he was then taken to court because this was in the New York sort of area of North America. There was a big storm, you see, and all this rain came down, and he was told he was responsible because he said he'd been making it. And he tried then, damnedest, to say he'd never made it. So you can imagine the problems that it would raise if we go in for geoengineering. And there are other things we can do. There's a lot of things we can do quite simply to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide or to stop it going into the atmosphere by changing the way we get our energy in the ways I've described. And it's not difficult and it's not that expensive. And it may be a bit expensive in the first time, but as the IEA have been proving and have been shouting now, they're trying to shout to the world, look here, it could be done. And also, you'll be better off because there won't be all that pollution anymore coming from fossil fuels and so on and so on. So,
do you think
geoengineering is a diversion that I think we can, on the whole, do without.
I was just going to ask, do you think the IEA's problem is they didn't have a good publisher?
Do you know about them? You should like them.
It's the Blue Book. Is that right? Is that the Energy Blue Book? No.
I'm trying to remember what colour it is. I don't remember actually, but they have
No,
lots of
to be
books.
honest, no, I don't know.
There come things. It comes out every year, and it's.
I think you have a little bit of information from it in your text.
Yes, I do,
Yeah.
and they're good volumes, and they have a. You can buy them from over online
Yeah.
quite easily, and all that sort of thing. But a lot of people seem to know about them.
No. They didn't have the
remarkably small.
Cambridge University Press marketing machine.
Yes,
behind them.
sure. Yeah. Yes, well, thank you. You've done a very good bit of marketing for us. Yes.
Okay, one more question, a couple more questions.
I just wonder if you could make any comment on the role of population increase. I mean, let us say if one went back 80 years ago when the population was just under 2 billion, and now, of course, hugely increased, what a possible effect that might have had, and also what future effect population increase, in your view, will have.
Well, I'm not an expert on population. And the answer to the question, of course, will be hand down that if increasing population, the amount of carbon dioxide would have been a lot less. If we carry on increasing at the present rate, then it's going to get a lot more. So somehow population has to be confined. And whether the world's ever going to address that issue in a big way, I don't know. And I wish it would, because I think it's very important for us to do that. And I think it's very important for the world's churches to address that issue, because certainly some churches are looking for greater population and saying we shouldn't put any limits on it at all because they're restricting our freedom. But then, if that's only helping to cause real damage to people in the future, then we've got to do something about it. So I think it's something that should be addressed. I have never given a lecture on it, and I don't know enough to do that, but I recognise the problem, and it's a problem that we all should be facing.
Okay, so one more question.
I had a question about carbon capture and storage.
Yes, can you just speak up, please?
Sorry, I had a question about carbon capture and
Yes.
storage and what contribution you thought perhaps that might make in the future. It seems, I admire your optimism that governments will address the problem of climate change, but I'm afraid I'm slightly more pessimistic because the 5-year government time scale seems to give them excuse to sort of let it become the problem of the next government.
Yes, you're absolutely right, of course. Yeah.
And CCS seems to be an example of where governments have failed to put any kind of mechanisms in to actually encourage oil companies perhaps to pump CO2 back underground.
Yes, I'm sorry to say that
So that
sentence
was
again.
about that it's encouraging maybe funding for putting the CO2 back underground, pumping it back underground.
Yes, well, yes, we can do that, and that's a good thing to do. It's not a cheap thing to do, actually. And people have been talking about, a few years ago, it was very popular, actually. An awful lot of carbon capture and storage was going to be done, or was said to be going to be done, and people said it should be done, as a result of no ordinary power stations going to pump it back into the ground. But very little of it's happened. And one reason is it's not cheap, and you have to find some money to do it. And that money has not been forthcoming because there's been no tax put on fuel. No, a much better thing to do is to put a carbon tax on fuel and reduce the amount of fuel that's burned. But governments seem utterly incapable of making that change. Now, I recognise there are big forces which are trying to stop them doing it, and they're hoping they're going to do it otherwise. But it's, the amount of subsidy to fossil fuel energy in fossil fuel energy worldwide is enormous. I forget the numbers now. I always quote numbers wrong, so I won't quote those numbers. But it's larger than all the money going into renewable energies. The subsidies on fossil fuel energies worldwide are greater, slightly greater, than all the money going into renewable energies worldwide. I think that's true. It might be for a restricted area of the world or the whole world. I'm not sure I've got it quite right. But it's crazy that when we're trying to cut our emissions, that all these subsidies are still there on fossil fuels. And I know a fair amount of that is in the developing world, but an awful lot is in the developed world too, including our own country.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. We're going to stop it there because there is a second part for anybody who wants to, because today is the opening of the Climate Change and the Nobel Peace Prize, 25 years of the publishing of the IPCC report. So we're hoping, especially visitors from the university, will move over to the museum next, and everybody's welcome. John's going to sign copies of his book for all of you visitors. We're going to give you a goodie bag to take home, so you'll get a copy of Global Warming and be able to see the exhibit there. So again, I just want to say a very big thank you, and I'm sure that you're happy to take questions. If anybody's got a burning questions they want to ask John individually, then it's going to be around for a few hours. Okay, so thanks again very much.